Hi, everyone. Please join me in welcoming Nicholas Tebben from Towson University. Nick's talk is titled The Community of Rational Beings. Take it away, Nick.
All right, thanks a lot. Let me share my screen because I got some slides for you. All right, you guys see that all right? Okay, so thanks for having me here. Like Zachary said, my name is Nick Tebben. I'm from the Towson University. And the talk today is on the community of rational beings. So I'm going to start with an executive summary on Sellars ethics, which if there's anybody who doesn't need an executive summary of Sellars ethics, it's you folks, but bear with me for a minute. So Sellars wants to show the moral judgments can be both cognitive and motivating, and he does this by taking to express intentions on behalf of a group to which one belongs. So they can be motivating because they're intentions on behalf of yourself as well as the group that you belong to, and they're cognitive because they bear logical relationships to other intentions that other people, other members of your group have. So if I intend for my family to go on vacation and my wife intends for the family to stay home, our intentions on behalf of our family conflict with each other. They bear this logical inconsistency with each other. And so this is how Sellars manages to make moral judgments both cognitive and motivating. He also takes it that the intention expressed by a true moral judgment must be categorically reasonable. So Sellars' ethics is explicitly Kantian. And he thinks that whatever true moral facts are, they have to be, the moral law has to be binding on you regardless of your station. It doesn't matter who you are or what you're doing. And so an intention that reflects the moral law has to be one that's reasonable for someone regardless of who they are, what they're doing, what social station they belong to. It has to be, in Sellars' words, categorically reasonable. And he thinks that eventually he tries to show that the moral law requires that one intend to promote the well-being of a community of which everyone is a member. That is the community of all rational beings. So you have to intend to promote the well-being of this community on behalf of this community itself. But the problem that I want to talk about today is that there's no force behind any of these claims. So if Sellars sat down and told someone about it, told a moral skeptic about this, or even just an ordinary person who's asked to make a substantial sacrifice for the sake of ethics, they could always say, why should I do that? And like the response, because it's immoral not to, might not cut much ice. So I want to talk about the force behind the moral law in Sellarsian ethics. Now, the question, why should you follow the moral law, is of course an old one. And Kant's answer to it is that you're essentially a rational being, and the moral law is a rational law. So to refuse to follow it is to deny your essential nature. So that's Kant's answer to the question that I'm considering today. Now, Sellars' ethics, like I said, is explicitly Kantian, but he despaired of providing an answer that mirrors Kant's. He tried to. Towards the end of Science and Metaphysics, he started in on an argument to this effect. And at some point he says that he can't figure out how to work it out from here. And so he says he regards this argument as incomplete. So what I want to do is I want to provide such an argument on Sellars' behalf. But my project here is not, it's not to finish Sellars' argument. So if Sellars abandoned the argument at the end of Science and Metaphysics, I'm not going to try to finish it. So my project here is not an elaboration on Sellars. It's not exegetical. It is, I think, my own argument, but it's supposed to be recognizably Sellarsian. I think, though, that the position that I'm going to sketch out here, which is closely based on Sellars' work, is, I find it at least independently plausible. So I'm going to try to assume as little of the rest of Sellars' philosophical picture as possible, while providing a justification for Sellarsian ethics. Now, the part of Sellars' ethics that I am going to accept is the idea that we are essentially rule-following beings. So in Language, Rules, and Behavior, which from 1949, Sellars puts this very picturesquely. He says, when God created Adam, he whispered in his ear, in all contexts of action, you will recognize rules, if only the rule to grope for rules to recognize. When you cease to recognize rules, you will walk on 4 feet. So what Sellars is telling us here is that he takes what is essential to human nature to be rule following. This is what's supposed to mirror Kant's claim that we're essentially rational beings. And when Sellars is talking about rule following, I take it that he means that we rule followers, we're the ones whose behavior is produced by reasons and not merely by causes. We occupy a position in the space of reasons, and our behavior reflects that position. So this is the part of Sellars' ethics that I am going to accept, that we are essentially rule following beings. So here's a preview of the argument. Sellars wanted to show 2 things. The first is we have to see ourselves as members of a community of all rational beings. All the rational folks are all parts of the same community, and we have to recognize ourselves as parts of that community. And second, we have to intend to promote the well-being of members of that community. And I'm going to argue the 1 and 2 both follow from the fact that we are essentially rule followers. So that essential bit of Sellars' ethics, that what distinguishes humans from all the other critters in the world is that we're rule following beings. And I'm going to say that's the basis for the ethical picture that Sellars is going to develop here. And it's also going to provide us the rationale for complying with the moral law. Now, to not see oneself as a member of this community or to refuse to intend to promote its members' well-being involves denying that you're a rule follower, if what I've said about 1 and 2 following from the fact that we're rule followers is true. And that's going to mean that it involves denying one's essential nature. So the argument that I'm going to give here is supposed to mirror Kant's, which should make good sense given the connection between Kantian ethics and Sellarsian ethics. Now, Sellars' ethics is a cosmopolitan ethics. So what he wants to do is he wants us to prescind from all of our parochial interests and our local cares, because we're supposed to consider a community not of our family or of our nation. He wants us to consider a community that includes everyone. But the problem here is that however breathtaking, as Sellars puts it, the cosmopolitan point of view might be, our interests largely are parochial, and our cares mostly are local. So the problem for cosmopolitanism really is one of motivation. You see this, Richard Burdi and Michael Sandel both talk about this. They talk about how when you zoom out to talk about everybody, you end up using thin ethical notions like right and wrong. And the thin ethical notions don't move us. The notions, the ethical concepts that move us are the thick ones, like betrayal and honor. And these are the kinds of ethical notions that find application in local groups, small communities where you identify closely with everyone in the community. So what I'm going to do, my strategy is to build big groups out of small ones. We already identify with small groups. And then I'm going to argue that given that we identify with some group or other, we also have to identify with larger ones. And at the limit, the community that includes everyone. So I'm going to do my best to leverage the affective connection that we have to little groups and show that it should extend out to larger groups as well. So here's how I'm going to build big groups. I'm going to start by showing that any group to which one might belong can be involved in disputes with other groups, in theory with any other group. And then I'm going to show that such disputes can be resolved by the giving and taking of reasons. So I think that it follows from the fact that we are essentially rule-following beings that any sort of dispute can be resolved, and in particular can be resolved rationally. And that if you can resolve a dispute rationally, it means that the parties to the dispute are in some sense a part of a shared community. So if you've got 2 individuals or 2 groups of individuals who can resolve the disputes between each other in a rational way, there's a sense, which I'll talk about in a minute, in which they're both parts of a yet larger community. So I'm going to build the big groups by talking about conflicts between smaller groups. Now, when a dispute can be resolved rationally, the parties to the dispute can say that there's something that we do. And in this sense, at least, they are part of a larger group. So I take it that there's a group or a community, at least in a very thin sense, if there's a group of people who can all recognize their interactions with each other as structured by the same set of norms. Now, to say that we do something isn't to say that we invariably do it, or it's not to say that no one ever violates these norms. Think about if you criticize someone by saying, that they behave rudely, and you say that's not done. When you're saying that, you're not saying that nobody behaves rudely. You are saying that there's a norm enforced that they're bound by. Or if you say that we don't do that, maybe you'd say this to a small child, you're not saying that grownups never do the thing that the small child did. You're saying that grownups are bound by a norm that prohibits this, and so are you. And by saying that we don't do this, you're saying that the child and the adults who are all bound by this norm are in some sense a part of the same community. Now, at the limit, I'm going to argue that the parties to any dispute, are parts of a group that includes everyone with whom one could exchange reasons. And I'm going to walk through some steps to get there. So I'm going to start by talking about local conflicts. Sellars' favorite example of a social group is a whooping crane society. So let's say that Alice is a member of the whooping crane society, and she thinks that they should hold a fundraiser on Saturday. Brian, also a member, disagrees. He thinks that they should clean up the wetlands on Saturday. So here we have two individuals who have a disagreement about what to do. In fact, we could have these people holding intentions on behalf of the Whooping Crane Society. Alice intends on behalf of the society to hold a fundraiser. Brian intends on behalf of the society to clean up the wetlands. And there's a way to resolve the dispute. Maybe the Whooping Crane Society holds a vote and decides to clean up the wetlands. So Alice might say, okay, well, the bylaws say that we resolve disputes by voting. That's what we do around here. And so she goes along with it. So the bylaws of the society are part of what makes the Whooping Crane Society a group. It establishes procedures for deciding for a group of people to collectively decide what to do. And in being bound by it, the people are therefore part of a single organization. There's other local conflicts, maybe the Chamber of Commerce. Cecilia thinks that they should lobby the governor on Saturday, and David, also a member of the chamber, thinks that they should work on their advertising on Saturday, and they resolve their dispute with another procedure. So the executive director says, okay, well, decides to lobby the governor, and David says, okay, well, how we do things around here is we follow what the governor says, or the director says. And so they're going to lobby the governor. So again, there's procedures for resolving disputes in the Chamber of Commerce, which tie its members together, and that's part of what allows the Chamber of Commerce to constitute a community. Now, the Whooping Crane Society and the Chamber of Commerce might themselves have a dispute. The Whooping Crane Society wants to preserve the whooping crane's habitat. The Chamber of Commerce wants to develop it. And there's ways of resolving their disputes. The Whooping Crane Society files a lawsuit and loses. Oh, well, Alice, member of the society, says, that's how we do things around here. The we here includes both the Whooping Crane Society and the Chamber of Commerce. She said, we'll try it next time. So the Whooping Crane Society and the Chamber of Commerce are members of a community, just like their members are members of their communities. Because just like there's a way for the members of the small communities to resolve their disputes, and hence a set of norms that tie them together, there's likewise a way to resolve disputes between these groups, and hence a set of norms that ties them together. And so they are, if you like, a part of a civil society or civil community. We've so far been talking about procedural resolutions to disputes, like voting or the executive director deciding something. There are set ways of doing it. But it's important, and it's going to be crucial for my argument, that you can have disputes resolved rationally through the giving and taking of reasons, even if there's no procedure established in advance for doing it. So maybe Senator Smith wants to build a monorail, and Senator Brown wants to cut taxes. Maybe they each intend on behalf of the government to do their favorite things. And one of the ways that they might resolve this dispute is through compromise and negotiation. Maybe Smith offers to cut taxes by less than Brown wants in exchange for a shorter monorail than he wants. So in making this offer, Smith has both changed his normative status and Brown's. He's put himself under some obligations. He has the obligation to go along with the monorail if Brown accepts the offer. He's given Brown some rights. Brown has the right to get the shorter monorail as long as he goes along with Smith's tax cuts. And there might not be any set procedure in advance about how this practical negotiation is going to go. But it's still a way of resolving their dispute that doesn't rely on force or trickery or coercion. It's still a way of resolving a dispute by the giving and taking of reasons. And so the senators could say, they could sit down and they say, that's how we do things around here in the Senate. We each get some of what we want, but not everything that we want, by compromising with other people. And so this procedure is ideally part of what makes the Senate a community. And so you can resolve your disputes by appeal to practical reasons and not just by appeal to dispute resolution procedures. So in general, to resolve a dispute through force or trickery or so forth, rather than by reasons, is to take one's own desires to take precedence over those of others, regardless of whether reasons tell in favor of satisfying one's desires. So Sellars in various places contrasts rule following with following habits. And I take it that indulging one's own desires is a habitual action in the sense that Sellars means it, is the sort of thing that's not informed by reasons. So rule followers act on the basis of reasons. They resolve their disputes by giving other people reasons for action, reasons for going along with what they're doing, not by forcing them, not by tricking them, not by coercing them. Now, since we're all rule followers, this means that we can always resolve our disputes without recourse to force. There's always a rule to follow. Now, that should follow from the fact that, or the assumption at any rate, that we are essentially rule followers. So given any two groups or even any two individuals, there's some way for them to resolve their dispute rationally rather than by force. And because we could have disputes between any arbitrary assortment of people, there's going to be some set of rules that's going to be binding on all of us. It's going to be a cosmopolitan rule. Now, the rules don't need to be set in advance, and they needn't be formalized. We already talked about why they need to be formalized, but they can also arise spontaneously. Hume talks about this. Lewis talks about it somewhat later. So Hume talks about people rowing in a rowboat, and they end up matching each other's rhythm in rowing to get themselves across the lake. Even though they don't talk about it, they don't say, hey, let's row at so many strokes per minute or something. It's just that they end up coordinating with each other in order to achieve their shared objectives. And given the arrangement that they've arrived at spontaneously, there is something that we do. So if one of them starts rowing faster, the other one can say, hey, that's not how we're doing it. Even though we didn't negotiate, we didn't talk about how to do it, we've arrived at a procedure here for rowing across the lake, and you're violating it. There's a norm that binds us, and I can give you a reason for following the rhythm that I'm following. Namely, this is what we've arrived at. And Lewis discusses how to do this in game theoretic terms. So the cosmopolitan rule, it need to be a procedural rule. Negotiation and compromise are rule governed in that they function by the giving and taking of reasons rather than by force. So whatever the rule that's going to bind everybody is, it doesn't have to be procedural and it doesn't have to be formalized. And in fact, I think it's neither one. Perhaps the only truly cosmopolitan rule, as Sellars himself says, is a rule that tells you to find rules to follow, to find some way to let reasons, whether theoretical or practical, whether procedurally set in advance or whether arrived at spontaneously, find some way to let reasons determine one's actions. That is perhaps the only truly cosmopolitan rule. And if it is, well, okay, here we go. So we've got some rule that's going to bind us all together. Now, it makes sense for those who are bound by a single rule to talk about what we do. And in that sense, at least they comprise a community. There's some sort of practice of behavior coordination that they're all bound by. And so they can say, these are the norms that structure our community. And since we're all governed by a cosmopolitan rule, we are all, at least in this sense, members of a community. We don't resolve our disputes through force. Now, when somebody does it, you can say, we don't do that. Which again, isn't to say that people don't do it. It's to say that there's a set of norms that structures all of our behavior, or should structure all of behavior. There's a set of norms that we're all bound by, and you're violating it if you resolve your disputes through force. So I think the community of all rational agents is the community of beings who resolve their disputes by giving each other reasons, not by force, not by trickery, not by coercion. And so there's, at least in this sense, a community of rational agents that any rule follower belongs to. And since we're all rule followers, we all belong to it. Now, I haven't yet shown that we have to intend the well-being of this group. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. So all members of a group G have the same interests qua members of G. So the other interests of the members of the Whooping Crane Society might vary. Some people might have interests in tennis. Some people might be interested in baseball. Some people might have investments. Others might not. So we've got lots of different interests amongst the members of the Whooping Crane Society. But insofar as they're members of the society, their interest is in protecting the whooping crane. So if A and B are both members of the Whooping Crane Society, A and B have the same interests qua members of the Whooping Crane Society. And insofar as A promotes B's interests qua member of the society, he promotes his own interests as well, because it's the same interest. More generally, all members of a group have the same interests qua members of that group. I actually think Sellars discusses this somewhere. So this is going to help us show that, that intending the well-being of the community of all rational agents is categorically reasonable. We'll get there, and so we'll get there in a second. So the intention to promote one's own interests has a kind of logical priority that the intention to promote someone else's interests usually doesn't. So when you're talking about promoting someone else's interests, the question, why do you want that? Why do you want to promote somebody else's interest seems to have application. Now, the answer to it could be for their sake or for the sake of morality or because it's the right thing to do. I'm not saying that everyone is like totally self-centered and self-interested. I'm saying that the question always makes sense. But it doesn't seem to make sense when applied to your own interests. Why are you pursuing your own interests? It doesn't seem to get any bite. So there seems to be, from a subjective perspective, a reasonableness that adheres to pursuing your own interests that doesn't necessarily attach to pursuing other people's interests. But there are exceptions. So if a member of G intends to promote the interests of other members of G, qua members of G, this intention enjoys the same kind of logical priority as the intention to promote one's own interests, because it's the same interest. Qua members of the group, you all have the same interest. And so if you and I are part of the same group and I intend to promote your interests qua members of that group, I'm thereby intending to promote my own interests. So the intention to promote the well-being of one's fellow group members, qua group members, enjoys the same kind of logical status as the intention to promote one's own well-being. So the question, why do you want to promote the well-being of other members of a group that you belong to, qua members of that group, doesn't make sense. So it is in this subjective sense reasonable. That doesn't yet show that it's categorically reasonable. There's another step. And here it is. It's unreasonable then. So it's subjectively reasonable, but is it objectively reasonable? Well, it's unreasonable to hold this intention, that is the intention to promote the well-being of the members of the group that you belong to, only if it's unreasonable to belong to this group. And the group at issue, of course, is the group of all rational beings, the group that has, that structures itself around the idea that we resolve our disputes through reasons and not by force. Now, is it unreasonable to belong to this group? No, of course not. You're essentially a rule follower. And the group of all rational beings is the group of rule followers. You don't have any choice but to belong to the group. So it might be unreasonable to promote the interests of groups that you belong to if it's unreasonable to belong to those groups. So if you're a member of the Nazi party, it's unreasonable to promote the interests of your fellow Nazis, qua members of the Nazi party, because it's not reasonable to belong to the Nazi party. But it has to be reasonable to belong to the community of all rational beings, because you don't have any choice on that one. So I want to take stock here. Disputes between rule followers can be resolved rationally. That's part of what makes you a rule follower. So there's a community of rule followers of which we're all members, because part of what we do is we resolve our disputes rationally. And we must intend to promote the interests of the members of this group qua members of this group, because those are the same interests that we've got. And it's categorically reasonable to belong to this group because we don't have any choice but to belong to it. So from the fact that you're a rule follower, from the fact that we're all rule followers, it follows that there's a community of which we're all members, the community that resolves its disputes rationally. And we have to intend to, by being a rule follower, you're committed to intending to promote the well-being of members of this group qua members of this group, because those are your own interests. And it's categorically reasonable to do so because you don't have any choice but belong to this group. Now, so I want to go back to the question about why should we follow the moral law? Well, according to Sellars, the moral law requires two things: that we see ourselves as members of a community of all rational beings, and we intend to promote the well-being of the members of that community. Since any dispute between rule followers can be resolved by appeal to reasons, all of us rule followers are members of a community. That is, we're members of the community that resolves its disputes rationally rather than by force. All members of this group have the same interests, qua members, and I must intend to promote my own interests, and so I must intend to promote their interests, qua members, as well. So as a rule follower, I am committed to promoting the well-being of everyone else who's also a rule follower. Now, you are, of course, free not to follow the moral law. There's no punishment for not doing it. There's no reward for being good. But not following the moral law involves denying that you're a rule follower. And since people are essentially rule followers, to fail to follow the moral law for Sellars, as for Kant, is to deny your own essential nature. And that's not nothing. To deny your own essential nature is to deny that you're a person in the fullest sense of that word. So I think that the force behind the moral law, the reason why should you follow the moral law, comes from the necessity of respecting yourself. If you don't follow the moral law, that is, if you don't intend to promote the well-being of the community of all rational beings, or the members of the community, you're saying, I'm not one of those rule followers. That is, I'm not really a person. In the way that Sellars puts it, I'm one of the ones who walks on 4 feet. And that's what I have for you today. Thank you very much. I uploaded the paper to Ronald's Google Drive folder, so you can go read it there if you wish. But thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks very much, Nick. It looks like we have plenty of extra time for Q&A. So I guess we'll just keep the queue going if after 25 minutes there's still more questions. If you'd like to use the raise hand functionality, if you go to the bottom of the screen, there's a little participants button, and then there will be a blue raise hand button. I can call on you and keep track of the queue in that way. Let's see. Carl Sachs.
So hi, hello everyone. Nice to see some familiar faces. So I guess there's a particular claim you tried to make, and I couldn't tell if it was a premise that you were not going to argue for, or if there's an argument for it that I kind of missed. But But it seems to me that an important part of the claim to make the ethics cosmopolitan is the idea that between any two groups, right, it's always possible to resolve disagreement by means of reason giving, right? Not just disagreements within a group, but between any two different groups, or any two groups that happen to be in conflict, that you can sort of figure out how to resolve things peacefully.
Right.
And well, first of all, I guess I might wonder what justifies that move, because certainly, empirically speaking, a lot of human history seems to stand against that claim. So I guess I might wonder what's motivating it. Because I would like it to be true. I like to be an optimist about human nature, but why is that not just a sort of a leap of humanistic faith? What's justifying that move?
So I think it follows from I hope it's a fact, but I'll treat it as an assumption, that we are essentially rule followers. We humans are the kind of things that can determine what to do by appeal to reasons, not merely by appeal to habits. And if that's true, and like I said, this is the assumption I'm carrying over from Sellars. I want the project here to be independently plausible, but recognizably Sellarsian. And the main sense in which is recognizably Sellarsian, I think at any rate, is that I'm taking on Sellars' commitment to the idea that we are all essentially rule following beings. And if we've got two communities that can't resolve their disputes by appeal to reasons, it means that they have to take it that their own desires take priority over the desires of, the group that they're in dispute with. And if you do that, you are determining your behavior non-rationally, not by appeal to rules, by appeal to mere causes. To say that, okay, and so I take it that it follows from the idea that we're essentially rule followers. Are we essentially rule followers? I didn't argue for that. That's the assumption I'm carrying over from Sellars. Now, to say that we resolve our disputes rationally, or to say that we can, isn't to say that we always do. In fact, we often don't. But that's not an objection to the idea that we are essentially rule followers, just like it's not an objection to Kant's claim that we're essentially rational beings by pointing out that we often behave irrationally. These are, a norm from which we should expect some amount of deviation. So I'm not surprised and I'm not troubled by the fact that we often do resolve our disputes by appeal to force rather than by appeal to rules. I think the idea that they can be resolved by appeal to reasons follows from the fact that we're rule followers, something for which I haven't argued, and I'm relying on Sellars' authority here.
Jeremy Coons.
Thank you. This was a really interesting paper. I really appreciated this, and I appreciate the different way you're trying to go about establishing this conclusion that is obviously central to Sellars' entire project here. I was reading your paper beforehand, and one of the concerns I have, I'm very sympathetic to your strategy. This idea that to be a rule follower is somehow going to entail that you're a member of the we, but I'm just wondering if some of the dialectical steps you take, I'm here. My worry is that you're building from the start. You're building into your argument a conception of rationality that's sort of friendly to your conclusion. So, you know, I will certainly grant that people are, that to be an agent is to be rule governed. That's what it is to be rational, is to be rule governed. But why this means that rationality then has to involve, it seems like there's a couple of steps from there to the idea that rationality has to involve sort of reasoned settling of disputes. Because I mean, there's different conceptions of rationality. And I take it that this is one of the reasons why Sellars always sets up the dialectic between rational egoism and the moral point of view. I mean, for the Chamber of Commerce to rationally resolve their dispute with the Whipping Cream Society, they might, you know, plant articles in the newspaper to discredit the Whipping Cream Society. That would be a very rational thing for them to do on a particular conception of rationality, right? And so I guess this idea that, well, I'm rule following, so now I have to respect the idea that you also are bound by reason. I mean, it seems like, you know, when you're acting in an egoistic way, you are acting on reasons. You're just acting on the wrong set of reasons from Sellers's point of view. That seems to be the prior question.
Okay, you're acting on some of the reasons, but not all of them. So if the Chamber of Commerce plants articles discrediting the Whooping Crane Society, they're acting on a proper subset of the reasons that are to be considered, in particular, the reasons that their own desires give them. Or, I mean, if the group doesn't have desires, it's objectives or whatever the motivating force is for a group. But they're ignoring some other reasons, in particular, the preferences of the Whooping Crane Society. So it's rational in a means end sort of way. But when Sellars is telling us that we are, when Sellars says that God whispers to Adam and tells him to follow rules, I don't think he's saying that Adam should be means ends rational. I think he's saying that what Adam should do is consider all of everything that's to be said for his course of action when determining what course of action to pursue. And so pure means ends reasoning, usually, and certainly in the case of the Whooping Crane Society planting the articles, involves ignoring some of the relevant reasons, and so not following rules in the sense that I think at any rate Sellars intends. Yeah, I think that's what I want to say. If you're just means ends rational, you're ignoring some of the relevant reasons, and so are having your behavior determined by something other than a consideration of everything that's to be said for it. Your behavior is then determined by a proper subset of what's to be said for it, which in this case and in most cases I can think of like this means that you're acting out of your self-interested habit rather than your appreciation of the normative facts as you find them.
Sellars does build a lot into the all things considered. That's true.
All right, Stephanie Dock.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the talk. I have a question on Sellars and how he construes the issue, because your aim was somehow to react to his failed or incomplete argument at the end of Science and Metaphysics. And when you look at his concerns there, then you see that there are actually two concerns. The first is whether there is a community of rational beings, yeah, whether we really form such a community. And then the second concern is, if we form such a community, then what kind of well-being it is we are concerned with. If it's the well-being just, say, of rational beings, qua rational beings, as you said, that would be, he says, if it's just the epistemic well-being, yeah, we are concerned with maybe the well-being of rational minds or something like that, yeah. Or whether it is not only this epistemic well-being, but unqualified well-being. And only then, he says, only if it's unqualified well-being, that includes, for example, you have that place in the paper where you say that when you are concerned with the well-being of the members of the Whooping Crane Society, then you are just concerned with their well-being qua members of that society and not with their financial affairs, for example. Yeah. So an unqualified well-being would include all of these aspects. So, for example, the financial affairs of rational beings and anything that you can imagine. Yeah, and he says, if I cannot establish that this is really this unqualified well-being which rational beings should care for in each other, then I cannot establish that this community of rational beings is really an ethical community, but it would be just concerned with the epistemic welfare of its members. I know that the paper was not like aimed primarily at these questions, but do you have any thoughts on that problem?
Sure. So intending the well-being of the community of the members of the community of rational beings, qua members of that community, isn't just intending their epistemic well-being. You're right, it doesn't entail intending their financial well-being. If establishing that we have to intend the well-being of the members of this community requires intending their well-being in every respect, I think that's hopeless, because different people, you have two different people whose interests conflict with each other, and you can't consistently intend to promote, both of these conflicting interests. Rational beings aren't just theoretical beings. They have practical concerns and practical interests, and I think that's mostly what I'm interested in here. So what is it for things to go well for a rational being qua rational being? So rational beings are the ones, the rule followers, they're the ones whose behavior is determined by considerations of reasons. And I take it that things go well for such a being when their autonomy is respected, when they're in a position to look at the reasons for and against their courses of action and determine what to do themselves, because they are the rational beings who can weigh these reasons. So if what we need is to intend everybody's well-being in every respect, no, that's hopeless. But when things go well for a rational being qua rational being, I think at any rate, their capacity to weigh reasons is itself respected, and hence their ability to determine their own behavior on the basis of those reasons is respected. So I think really what my elaboration of Sellars gets us, it's not even elaboration, my Sellarsian argument gets us, is something very close to what Kant gets us, something like the formulation of humanity of the categorical imperative. So it's not just epistemic well-being. You're right, it's not well-being in every respect, but it's well-being in the respect that mattered for Kant and strikes me matters ethically. So if I didn't get everything that Sellars wanted, okay, but I think it's the important part. You've got here. Is that fair?
Okay. Bill DeVries.
Hi, thanks very much. Carl asked the question I was originally going to ask, but to pick up then on his question some more, it seems to me that you're also putting a lot of weight on the notion of an essence here. And to say that we are essentially rule followers, I'm a little bit worried about that. Not because I think we're not, but because I think saying that with regard to persons is saying it, as it were, in a normative mode, right? We have persons are the beings that are supposed to be rule followers, and too often are not. So I'm not sure that the claim that we're essentially rule followers is quite going to handle the weight you want to put on it. It's not like, saying that the essence of water is to be H2O. That's, as it were, an alethic necessity, whereas the necessity of a person's being a rule follower is merely deontic. So I'm a bit worried about that.
Okay. How about this? Let's talk about baseball. Baseball is my favorite sport. There is, in some sense, an essence to baseball players. Bear with me here. There are baseball rules they comply with. After 3 strikes, they're out and they go sit down on the bench. Could you have a baseball player who stood up, who took his 3rd strike and refused to leave the batter's box? I mean, I guess. You could say we don't do that, right? So maybe it's a little kid who's learning how to play baseball. He gets the 3rd strike and doesn't leave. And the coach says, "Hey, Jimmy, come on back." And Jimmy says, "What? I'm batting." And he says, and the coach says, No. You got your 3rd strike. We don't stay up there after your 3rd strike. That's essential to being a baseball player. Now, to say that it's so, but it's again a deontic kind of necessity, right? Not like, as you said, an alethetic necessity, because baseball players sometimes do stand up there for their 4th strike. Sometimes they do cork their bats. Baseball players cheat. And yet it seems to make good sense to say that this is what makes baseball players and differentiates them from basketball players and from chess players and from all of the other sports players. And you could say that maybe we have a convention, the convention of baseball players, and all of the baseball players belong here. But the people who belong in this convention, the community of baseball players here, aren't just the people who go and sit down on the bench after their 3rd strike. Jimmy gets invited. He's a baseball player too, even though he violates the rules. Because qua baseball player, it's essential to his nature that he's bound by this norm. So I think that at least some categories, baseball players, persons, maybe these are normative categories, can have as their essence normative necessities, even if the actual things that fall into these categories violate those norms.
Okay. I think I'll slot myself into the queue right now. So I had a question. It's a wrinkle that occurred to me in reading your paper. I don't think I mean this as an objection. I don't think it's vitiating to your project at all. In fact, I think, I wonder if you'll agree, I think it may even help you out in responding to the kind of worry that Carl was raising earlier in Q&A. It has to do with your key premise that different groups of people can rationally resolve intergroup disputes. And the fact that it occurred to me in reading this that, well, there's more than one kind of can, right? So there's sometimes when we talk about people's abilities or what they can do, we're interested in what is sort of immediately available for them to do. And then sometimes we're talking in broader terms about what their abilities, what the kind of creature they are, means that they have abilities to do if those abilities are suitably developed, if put in the proper conditions, and so on and so forth. And so this broader sense of can seems to me to be the one that you want for this premise to be believable, right? Because I'm thinking about, to take an example of a current sort of inter-group dispute, think about the relationship of people who are, let's say, in a more scientifically reliable epistemic community to people who are vaccine skeptics about the COVID vaccine or something like that. A lot of these people are such that right now, it's just as a matter of empirical facts, the way to change their mind is not by reasoning with them. It's just not going to work because they'll Tollins your opponents all day long. Whatever you give them, they won't find it credible. And they'll give you something else that they do find credible, which to you will be patently uncredible. So the thought is that not that such people are, not rational beings, not capable of reason, but just that there are certain kinds of immediate conditions, maybe conditions like having to do with social trust and so on, that need to be established first beforehand. So in order that in this more immediate sense, we could resolve a dispute with them by giving and taking of reasons. But right now, only in this more attenuated sense could we resolve a dispute by them. By giving and taking of reasons, and what is required right now is something that's maybe pre-rational, that involves establishing a kind sort of pre-rational kinds of social bonds which enable people to trust one another. Just another thing I was thinking about in relation to this was the fact that what they tell people to do when they're doing like political organizing, going door to door, is not to, when they find someone who disagrees with them, try and debate them, but rather to listen to them and try to form a kind of human relationship on the basis of shared experiences, and then get to, once you've established a kind of relationship of trust, maybe giving and taking of reasons. So I'm wondering if you agree with me that we should read this can in your key premise in this more attenuated sense, and whether you think that distinction is important.
Yes, actually, that's how I intended it. That is what I mean. And actually, I used to do political canvassing. So I'm familiar with the necessity to build trust. Yeah, you debate somebody who disagrees with you about politics, it goes nowhere. I don't mean to say that any two people can sit down right now and give each other reasons and work out whatever they've got. Now, the hopes for doing that are probably better than you've led on, because, and I think I really think this is crucial for the idea that we can resolve any dispute between two people. The giving and taking of reasons aren't just theoretical reasons. It's not just a matter of convincing somebody that you should be doing, that they should go along with what you're doing. I really do, and I think it's essential to include practical reasons also. So paying somebody to do something is giving them a kind of a practical reason. Or in my example, compromising with people, that is going to count as giving and taking reasons also. But yeah, to say that we can always resolve our disputes rationally isn't to say that we can do it right now. It's to say that there's a part of our essence, in a sense that might be objectionable, but I think is okay given that we're talking about a normative category here. There's a part of our essence that if you get to it, right, if you can uncover this part of yourself, you can work things out with other people. So like, I mean, so similarly, it's not an objection to Kant that people are sometimes irrational. He can still be right that our essence is to be a rational being, even if we recognize that people commit the gambler's fallacy and all sorts of things like that. The idea is that there's something in you that if you can uncover it, or if you can work it out together, is going to allow you to work together in a rational way. So all I'm saying is I think you're right. That's how I meant it.
Thanks. Kyle Ferguson.
Hi, Nicholas. Thanks very much for your paper and your presentation. I'm thinking about a passage that's in towards the end of Science and Ethics, where it's one of the places where Sellars cites Joseph Butler. And I'm thinking that the story you're telling, that's the kind of answer we give to someone in a cool hour who's asking why they should do their duty. But I'm wondering about the other kind of story that we might tell. And here I'm thinking of Adam. One thing that's weird about Adam is motherless. He was never a child raised by others. So there was never this process of acquiring a second nature where you're brought up by other people. And Sellars says that this concern for other people is this really precious thing that's laid down in childhood. And it doesn't seem to be a matter of rule following. It doesn't seem to be a matter of being rational, but it's more affective. And I'm wondering what you think about that kind of care and that kind of concern, its role in this story, and whether that counts as rule following.
So I think it's relevant to rule following insofar as affective responses give you reasons for things, which they can, right? So, you know, a reason not to cheat on your wife is that you love her. So there's an affective response that gives you a reason to do things. So this isn't divorced from your affective responses to your environment or to other people. Okay, so this might not be satisfying, but let me see. The bit about cosmopolitanism in the middle of the paper is perhaps not strictly necessary for the rest of the argument. So I talked there about how what we find motivating are like the thick ethical concepts and your connections to, you know, your immediate surroundings, not this high-level cosmopolitan point of view. I think the main argument of the paper goes through without trying to build up big groups from small groups. I think the main part of the argument is going to go through, even if we just recognize that any two people can disagree with each other. And given that they're all rule followers, their disputes can be rationally resolved. When talking about the cosmopolitanism stuff and talking about the fact that we get the affective heft when we talk about thick ethical concepts that come up in local contexts, what I wanted to do, I don't know if this is going to work, but what I wanted to do is I wanted to say that recognizing that you're a part of a group that does tie you in emotionally with other people, that allows you to employ concepts like betrayal and honor and all these thick concepts, rationally commits you to being tied to bigger groups also. And so I realized that affective responses don't necessarily answer to rational considerations. But if your response to your close fellows has this emotional component to it, and if being close fellows with people commits you to being fellows in some sense to larger groups also, you at least should recognize that you should care about them also. Which you might not, right? I'm not saying that you will, but I'm saying that you've got a reason to do it. Now, how you actually get people to do it, I don't know, talk to a psychologist. But given that membership in big groups follows from membership in small groups, and given that you have an emotional connection to small groups, you ought to have emotional connection to big groups also. Okay, somebody says, is threatening people giving them reasons to do X? I saw that in the chat. I want to talk about that. Personally, I find the difference between offers and threats very fascinating and really hard to parse out. Is it giving them a reason? Well, okay, I guess I want to say a couple of things about that. One is not necessarily. So if you threaten somebody and it gets them to do something just out of pure terror, then it's not giving them a reason, right? So if you point your gun at me and say your money or your life, and I just hand you my wallet, you're not giving me a reason to do it because I'm just reacting out of terror. On the other hand, you could say your money or your life, and I could look at this and I could say, well, I don't know, how much money is in my wallet? How much would it hurt to get shot, and weigh the pros and the cons? Is that giving me a reason? Well, in that sense, yeah, sure. But if you are demanding my money of me at gunpoint, you are taking your own preferences to take priority over my preferences, without regard for whether or not they should take priority over my preferences. So it's like a degenerate kind of reason giving. Sure, it's a reason, but it's a reason that you ought not to offer me, because in doing it, you're ignoring some of the things that tell against this course of action. That is, you're not responding to reasons.
Mark Joseph.
Thanks. Yeah, and thanks, Nicholas, for the paper. It was really interesting. So my question is that a common form that ethical problems take is that there may be two groups, one of whom doesn't recognize the other as part of the we, or part of the relevant we. And so that cuts off the move to a higher, more comprehensive we, at which level there may be shared interests that can be used to resolve whatever problem is on the table. And I'm curious whether you would discount that as just as just a factual mistake, and as a factual mistake, not part of the ethical project, and so just kind of off to the side. I guess this is a problem, or it could be a problem with lots of ethical theories, but it seems to really go to the heart of the structure of your particular theory, or the way you develop a kind of Sellarsian point. And I guess one could modify the question. So maybe it's not so much that the one group doesn't recognize the other group as part of the we. It could be that there are a series of we's, kind of a stratified we's, some of which are considered more important than others, or more relevant than others. And so the disfavored group may be considered a we that doesn't really matter in these kinds of questions. So that, again, the discounting this other group as part of the relevant we cuts off the move to a level at which the ethical dispute can be resolved.
So I think this is an instance of what Zach Gaber was talking about earlier. He asked whether the claim that we can resolve disputes means we can do it right now, anybody can sit down and resolve them, or whether it means that given suitable work on their part, they're capable of doing it. I said the latter, right? That was what Zach suggested, and I said, yes, that's right. So if we've got one group who doesn't recognize another group as a member of the we, they say, well, those aren't humans, right? So they dehumanize them. That's going to prevent them from sitting down and resolving their disputes rationally right now. But if Sellars is right that we're essentially rule followers, you should be able to, well, hold on. Yeah, so there may well be some work to do before two people or two groups can sit down and resolve their disputes. One of the things they're going to need to do is recognize the others as fellow rule followers. You might also need to, and like Zach was talking about, developing trust with them. That might be necessary also. So the fact that some groups are willing to write off other groups and say we don't need to take them into consideration, that doesn't mean that they can't resolve their disputes rationally or by the giving or taking of reasons. It means that might mean that they're not going to. It certainly means they need to do some work before they can do it. But if they're apprised of the fact that they and the disfavored group are both rule followers, and if they recognize what follows from the fact that you're a rule follower, you know, if they read my paper, they should be able to recognize that they are in a position, there's some way that they can work with these people to resolve their dispute without resorting to force. I'm not saying they will, I'm not optimistic for them doing it, right? I'm not pointing to any utopia here. But it is expected and not especially problematic that some groups are going to write off other ones, because recognizing what follows from your essential nature takes work. I mean, so think about, so Sellars ethics is supposed to be Kantian. Think about what it takes to recognize the categorical imperative, right? You have to, the derivation is humongous. And yet you're supposed to be a self-legislator, right? You give yourself the categorical imperative in the sense that it follows from your essential nature, not in the sense that anybody should be able to sit down and write the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. It took Kant to do that for us. And I think you could say the same thing for Sellars here.
All right. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I don't see any hands in the chat or in the participants tab. I see one bunch of interesting things in the chat, one of which ends with a question mark. So I'll read Kirill Potapov's question. So Kirill writes, Alistair McIntyre seems to go some way towards a similar account, but he also focuses a lot on the ways in which the gulfs between groups can't be overcome. For him, this depends on ideas of recognizing goods. Nicholas's account, are such gulfs just failures of rationality?
All I can say is I haven't read the relevant McIntyre version,
Okay.
sorry. But I'm taking notes. I did write it down because I saw that in there earlier.
Okay.
Actually, can you tell me where McIntyre discusses this so that I don't have to read all of it?
So he's got a 2016 book, which is like a summary of his position, of all of his philosophy, which I'll put in the chat. But yeah, I'll just
okay.
Put it in the chat.
Okay, Ronald, I saw your hand go up quickly. Do you have a quick question?
Yeah, actually, the way I understand Kirill's question is whether it's there's a possibility. I mean, I don't know whether that's the way you understand it, Kirill, but that there is not just incompatibility in initial outlooks between between communities, but in incommensurabilities. So not incompatibility, but incommensurability. And the way I understand Kirill's question is whether, assuming that this might be possible, and I was thinking of Native American tribes versus white settlers thinking out privately owning land, for example. I mean, arguably that could be an incommensurability. And whether that would be just a failure of rationality, according to your view, Nick, or whether there might be something missing in Sellars' ethics here.
If there's genuine incommensurability, so if it's not just a failure of rationality, I think Sellars' ethics is in trouble. I don't know if Sellars himself addresses this anywhere, but it certainly seems to me like an essential component of his ethical picture is that there isn't any such thing. That it could in principle be worked out. I don't know if he's got an argument to that effect or not. I don't have one handy. If there is genuine incommensurability, then we're in trouble. But I think that it's a part of Sellars' ethics that there isn't.
All right. On my watch, I think that we have 11:10. Okay, so I think we'll call it here. And join me in thanking Nick again for an awesome talk and prompting a lively discussion.
Thanks, everyone.